Hello everyone and welcome to another installment of the Figuring Out Fatherhood Chris Unplugged podcast. This podcast is a spin-off of the original Figuring Out Fatherhood series, which you can find in the link in the description below. This podcast is an important part of my journey, and what I do is I share important life topics, life skills, fatherhood advice, parental advice that I've picked up along the way, and I share it with you to hopefully help in your journey to becoming a better version of yourself and your journey to becoming a better parent as well. You can follow me on my personal Instagram page, which is Chris_Topper. You can follow the Figuring Out Fatherhood page, which is Figuring Out Fatherhood on one word, all one word underscore. On today's episode, I'm going to cover the impacts of childhood trauma on our ability to parent. This topic is actually requested by someone who's actually following the Figuring Out Fatherhood page on Instagram. And just FYI, if you'd like me to cover any specific topics, anything you want me to highlight on or speak on, just drop me your comments or feel free to send me a DM on Instagram, or you can actually email me as well at chris@figuringoutfatherhood.com, and I will be sure to cover it. Unresolved childhood trauma is usually carried into adulthood, and what you tend to find is people who seek out therapy or counselling to deal with issues that they're facing at the moment tend to find that the root cause of the issue they're facing is due to something that they've experienced in their childhood. Now, this is not to say this our parents are to blame. You need to remember that our parents, they're human beings. They make mistakes and they're flawed just like anyone else. A lot of people get caught up in not repeating their parents' mistakes as opposed to figuring out what kind of parent they want to be, figuring out what their child's specific needs are from them and trying to be that parent or take the necessary steps to being that parent. A lot of people view parenthood as a clean slate. In fact, there aren't many things in this world that could make an individual focus on the future more than having a child. But in order for us to maximize our parent potential and be the parent that we want to be, we need to come to terms with what's happened in the past, make peace with it, and make sure that we have no lingering unresolved childhood trauma. We need to process things that happen to us as children, which will make us better parents for our children. So, as usual, I'm going to cover what childhood trauma actually is, specifically. Then I'm going to cover how childhood trauma affects us as adults. Then I'm going to cover how childhood trauma affects our parenting styles. Childhood trauma is often referred to by different names, but the two most common you'll find are adverse childhood experiences and childhood maltreatment. The World Health Organization refers to childhood trauma as all forms of physical and emotional abuse, neglect, or exploitation, which could lead to actual or potential harm to the child. Childhood trauma to me refers to a wide range of negative childhood experiences, which could include, but are not limited to, all forms of abuse. I'll be physical, mental, emotional abuse. It could be sexual abuse. It could be witnessing violence in your community. It could be an inconsistent parent, an absent parent. Childhood trauma essentially refers to anything that happens to a child which has a profound psychological, physiological, or sociological impact on the child, potentially leading to long-lasting effects on their health and well-being. When you think of the word childhood, more often than not, you think of the word innocence, you think of joy, optimism, you think of the future. However, when trauma is attached to it, for some of us, even as adults, it's difficult for us to process these things. However, imagine what it's like for a child to process these things. They don't have the benefit of life experience, they don't have the benefit of education. They're just processing it in their own way, and more often than not, they take the blame for whatever's happened onto themselves. And that's just one reason why it's important that we address childhood trauma. Next, we're going to cover how childhood trauma impacts us as adults. Childhood trauma is complex at minimum, and how it manifests itself and varies from person to person. But there are some commonalities across people that have experienced childhood trauma. First thing we'll cover is attachment disorders. These lead to difficulties in forming relationships with people, and essentially it stems from experiencing childhood trauma as a child by potentially someone you view as a caregiver or as a protector, and it sort of warps your view as to their responsibilities as your caregiver. Now, you may have heard of different attachment styles that we experience as adults, but what you may not realize is how they're linked to childhood trauma. And I'll just go through a few to make you familiar with them. The first attachment disorder to consider is the dismissive avoidance. When you come across these people, you tend to find that they're ultra independent, and this is because they actually fear rejection. They don't want to be rejected ever again. This tends to happen when they've been neglected or ignored or rejected as children, so they grow up with this hyper independence so they don't need to rely on anyone moving forward. And it's also to mask their fear of rejection as well. The second attachment style I'll be covering is the fearful avoidant attachment style. This tends to happen when the child has experienced neglect or abuse when they're younger. So they grow up fearful and distrustful of people. And as a result, they're fearful of relationships and intimacy and closeness with people. What you find is these type of people, when they have a partner, they tend to be a bit disconnected from their partner. The third attachment disorders covered is the anxious preoccupied attachment style. This tends to manifest itself as sort of like needy or clingy people. And this is often as a result of emotional imbalance by their parents when they were being raised. As adults, they never feel entirely secure in their relationships, and this is off the back of their parents being inconsistent with the emotional security they're providing for them. One minute you're all over your child, you're loving them so much, and next minute you're rejecting your child. This leads to confusion in the child, and it tends to lead to the child being unsure if they're loved or not and requiring validation on a frequent basis. After attachment disorders, the second way in which childhood trauma impacts us as adults is our emotional health. Survivors of childhood trauma tend to have feelings of guilt, shame, anxiety, anger, hopelessness, amongst a wide variety of other emotions. In addition to this, they may also struggle with emotional regulation. And when I say emotional regulation, what I mean is how they regulate their emotions on a day-to-day basis. Something could happen that triggers an overly emotional response, which doesn't match the stimulus. The third way in which childhood trauma impacts us as adults is our mental health. Survivors of childhood trauma tend to experience depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, amongst a wide array of other things. And this is because as adults, they may struggle with conflict resolution and stress management, leading to them adopting unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as overeating or substance abuse, like using drugs. And this is just to help them deal with their internal conflict off the back of the trauma they face as a child. The fourth way in which childhood trauma impacts us as adults is our actual physical health. Survivors of childhood trauma tend to have developed a heightened stress response, as I covered earlier, and as a result of this, they may struggle to sleep, struggle to unwind, struggle to relax, which in turn will lead to have its own health complications. It also impacts your immunity as well, which increases the risk of getting physically ill. Please note that list was not exhaustive, and it's just to give an idea of what childhood trauma looks like in adults. The effects of childhood trauma could actually be passed on from generation to generation, so you could actually pass on to your children if left unresolved. This is also known as intergenerational or transgenerational trauma. Now, experts debate on whether this actually exists or not. However, it's been seen, and some researchers have realized that it actually does happen, and the way this manifests itself is in our parenting behaviors. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to cover how childhood trauma impacts our parenting behaviors. Avoidance. Consciously or subconsciously, some adults who've experienced childhood trauma grow up avoiding certain things, or avoiding certain memories, or avoiding anything that may trigger a memory that's associated with their trauma. And if the child themselves reminds them of their trauma, in some instances, not that I endorse this by any means necessary, please, in some instances, some parents may just want to avoid being in their child's life completely if it's a constant reminder of trauma that they faced. Overprotection. Due to past trauma faced by the parent, they may be determined to protect the child from ever facing that same thing, or having that same experience. And this is absolutely fine. But you also need to keep in mind the fact that when you overprotect your child, you are limiting their experiences as well. And if at any point in time they do come across that experience, they may not be equipped to handle it. An example is university. You find that a lot of children who have been overprotected growing up, when they go to university, they tend to lose their heads, or they're not sure what to do with so much freedom. Alternatively, actually, overprotecting a child could lead to them resenting you because you're preventing them from living what they believe to be a full life. In addition to this, they're also at risk of being avoidant because they have been able to assess the risk associated with their experience, so they're not sure of how to tackle it. Over-controlling. Childhood trauma could lead to parents being over-controlling in order to compensate for feeling helpless or hopeless while they're experiencing trauma as a child. This could lead to rebellious behavior in the child as they just want to be free, or it could also risk them not being able to live independently because their lives have been controlled for so long by their parent. Emotional separation. This is actually quite common amongst people who have survived childhood trauma, and what tends to happen is they will avoid vulnerable moments or moments where they are sharing their emotions with people. And this also feeds into their interactions with their child, because where this, as a parent, you're meant to create a space where a child can be emotionally open and vulnerable with you. If you avoid that situation, what tends to happen is the child is unable to fully express their emotions or work through their emotions or figure out their emotions, because you have detached yourself, or you detach your emotions from them. And as a result, what you've done is you now continue that cycle of emotional separation, because they will also grow up being unable to be vulnerable with their children. In order to reduce the impacts of childhood trauma, it's important that it's identified early in a child's life. But research shows that people who've experienced childhood trauma aren't likely to voluntarily speak about their trauma, especially not as a child. They tend to hide it, especially because they blame themselves for what's happened. So with that comes challenges of asking the child about trauma they may have experienced, and they may in turn find this very distressing, or you as the parent may find that distressing as well. So whereas I encourage you to speak to a professional, it could be a child therapist, a family mediator, a family counselor, or someone who is able to provide your child with professional help. As I'm wrapping up this episode, there are 3 important points I want to cover before I leave. The first one is trauma isn't stored in our brains like a memory. It's stored in fragments, and when we experience something that triggers us, we tend to feel it before we even realize what's happening. This in itself makes it difficult to identify as an individual that whatever is you're experiencing may be linked to trauma that you experienced as a child. So as a result of that, the trauma will be left unresolved just due to you thinking that it's a natural response. The second point I want to cover is healthy relationships between parents/caregivers and their children will help negate or reduce the impacts of childhood trauma. However, the flip side to that is if the parent or the caregiver is responsible for that trauma, this will have profound impacts on the child. So please, please, please be very conscious of what you're doing and the things you're doing to your child. The third and final point is if you or anyone else is struggling with child or past trauma, I want you to recognize the strength it takes as a survivor, right? But if you have unresolved childhood trauma, I would encourage you to speak to a counselor or therapist as soon as possible in order to address this. Continuing to live with unresolved trauma will have a negative impact on your well-being and on your health. You could potentially carry it on to the next generation as well. There are a lot of things you want to pass down to your child, but I'm pretty sure trauma isn't one of them. Healing your unresolved trauma will free you to be the parent that you want to be. And that's all I have for today, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, found it informative, feel like anyone will benefit from it, make sure you like it, make sure you share it with your friends, share it on social media, share it with someone who you feel will benefit from having this information. In addition to that, make sure you follow me on my personal Instagram page, that's Chris_Topper. Make sure you follow the Figuring Out Fatherhood page, which is Figuring Out Fatherhood, all one word, _. And finally, make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. And I'm going to leave you how I always leave you guys, and that's to make it your mission today to make a decision that future you'll be grateful for. Future you'll be grateful for addressing your unresolved childhood trauma. In addition to this, your child or your children also benefit from you addressing your unresolved trauma. So until next time, guys,